Welcome to Analysis. I'm John Rees. Keir Starmer's government is in a terrible place in the polls and would be eradicated by Nigel Farage's Reform UK if a general election were held now. Luckily for Starmer, his Commons majority is so large that it will protect him, at least in the short term. But Labour really needed its annual conference to turn the tide. We made this report earlier. The Labour Party conference in Liverpool has just concluded, with government ministers facing two ways on Nigel Farage's Reform UK. Labour had little choice but to use the conference to make its best case against reform, given that Farage has eclipsed the Tory party as the looming electoral threat to Labour. And in his keynote speech to conference, Prime Minister Keir Starmer called out Nigel Farage as a racist, highlighting Reform's plans for mass deportations of migrants. Starmer's defence of multiculturalism was one of the best received parts of his speech, cheered to the echo by delegates. But the fault line in Starmer's strategy for dealing with reform was instantly visible when government ministers in the conference front rows were pictured waving St George's Cross flags that they had been specially provided for in order to demonstrate their patriotism. This, of course, the visual language of the populist right, used extensively in the recent Fly the Flag campaign and by Tommy Robinson supporters as they rampaged through central London recently. The fault line, however, runs deeper than mere iconography. In substantive policy terms, Starmer has shifted Labour so that it mimics Farage's hostility to immigrants. He left it to the new hardline Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, to unveil the details. But when she did, they were punitive. Labour will demand that immigrants speak English to a high level, a bar which even some white British-born citizens might find hard to clear. Then immigrants would need to earn £10,000 a year above the national average, never claim sickness or unemployment benefits, and do voluntary work. And all this for a decade rather than the current 5 years before they become citizens. It's a policy every bit as discriminatory as Farage's policy, and it demonises immigrants as second-class citizens. As such, it's likely to feed reform, since voters inclined to support this kind of discrimination are unlikely to be deterred from adopting Farage's full-throated racism by Starmer's adoption of this approach. With Rachel Rees about to hammer the core of working population with tax rises, discontent with Starmer and his government is unlikely to recover in the polls before next May's local elections. Of course, Farage isn't the only difficulty that the Labour leadership faced. They're on the run over Gaza and lost an important vote on that issue on the conference floor. So what does the future hold? Will Starmer fall even if Labour survives in government? And how will the coming budget statement play into these developments? Well, to discuss all this, I'm joined by John McDonnell, Labour MP for Hayes-and-Harlington. John, welcome to the programme. First of all, just give me your sort of overall take on how that conference went.
I think what the conference was, and particularly Keir Starmer's speech, it was about shoring up support within the Labour Party than dealing with the wider issues that we're facing as a society. I want to take on this particular issue with regard to Farage. Where we're at in terms of the Labour Party at the moment is we're losing council seat after council seat in by-elections, and the Labour vote has dropped anything between 10 and 20%. In the opinion polls, the Reform Party are ahead of us, anything between, it can be 3 points or sometimes up to about 10. So it's quite clear that the Labour Party under Keir Starmer has serious problems in just basic electoral support. And you get that on the doorstep in every constituency around the country where MPs are knocking on doors. People are raising their concerns about this Starmer government because, 14 years of austerity under the Tories, they were promised change under Labour. Labour gets elected and people aren't seeing the change. There's a number of policies that they're advocating, which, for example, the building of 1.5 million new homes in the NHS and in education over time. They're all policies that will take time to develop, as long as they're properly managed and as long as they're effectively targeted at what people need. But in the meantime, people are suffering from a cost of living crisis. So what's happening on the doorstep is that people are saying, fine, you can tell us your policy program for the future, but what are you going to do about me now? And in my constituency, you knock on a door and people will tell you that their rents have gone up anything like 15% over the last year or so, or they're young people who've bought properties on leasehold and their service charges have gone up, well, 200% in some instances over the last couple of years. So what happened is that the conference seemed to be debating it's really the Starmer leadership in relation to what Labour members feel he should be doing, but never really got that response. And if you're going to defeat Farage, of course you can go into rhetorical attacks, but the real way is to undercut the ability for him to mobilise people. And we've seen this before from the right-wing demagogic readers. What they do is they feed off people's discontent, and it's largely economic discontent. So when you've had an economic crisis, the banking crisis, the replication of that is in terms of the austerity measures that are taking place. People are obviously really discontented. They're having a hard time. Their children are having a hard time as well. So what they want change, and when that's not delivered, it's so easy for a demagogue to come along and then say, well, it's not the system, it's not the establishment, point towards a minority group, and that's what they're doing at the moment. And Starmer, for all the rhetoric about holding society together, the diversity of society and respecting that, of course, but actually you need to also then to say the policies here are going to these are the policies that are going to tackle the problems, everyday problems that people are facing, and we're going to do it now. We're not waiting for a couple of years or 5 years or an implementation of our housing program. So that for me, it lacked the bite and essential policy development that was needed. I'll give you one example, John. I lost the Labour whip because I voted to scrap the two-child limit. Two-child limit, if it was scrapped, would lift about 490,000 children out of poverty. 30% of the children in my constituency are living in poverty. So we get rid of the two-child limit, and it would transform a large number of children's lives. We get to Labour Party conference, and I honestly thought in Starmer's speech, when he made reference to child poverty, he was going to say, yes, we're going to scrap the two-child limit, and he didn't. What happened later, there was a leak from, well, I think a planted story saying they're considering maybe lifting the limit to 3 or 4 children or whatever. It was just the actions did not follow the rhetoric. That was the main issue for me.
I mean, that was quite a gulf, wasn't it, on this issue, because the defence of kind of multiculturalism, when they're coming out and branding Farage as a racist, certainly seemed to hurt Farage. He went straight onto the television, sort of decrying this and saying that all his millions of supporters were being described as racist, etc. So that hit home. But then the actual policy shift is very, very strongly in the direction of that Farage himself had laid out.
Well, one of the policy areas, if you recall from Keir Starmer's speech, where he's accusing Farage of racism, is about denying the right of people with indefinite leave to remain in the country. And I thought this is a startling policy. I have a large number of constituents, in fact, family members who've got indefinite leave to remain. And it would be catastrophic for them. Many of them have lived in this country, not just years, decades. What Labour then does, instead of confronting and saying, yeah, this is racist, what it does, it comes out with its own proposals on indefinite leave to remain, extending the waiting time before you can apply from 5 to 10 years. And then also saying, you've got to do voluntary effort, or you've got to lay in more and more conditions on it. And I just thought, why are we dancing to Farage's tune? You're playing into his hands instead of defending the principle of indefinite leave to remain and defending those people in this country who have indefinite leave to remain and make such a huge contribution. Why are you dancing to this Farage tune? And what happened was we seem to think that the opposition to Farage and the way to defeat him is to become, well, as Bell Ribeiro say, out-reform reform. That will never work. And it isn't. It goes against the grain of what Labour supporters believe and feel as well, their values. It would be much better to really tackle, I think, the underlying issues that Farage is exploiting to enable him, therefore, to gain this sort of level of popularity he's got. And the only way you can do that is to have a clear analysis of the situation, but then follow up your analysis with a policy program that will transform the lives of people. And that's why I've been saying, all right, the conference is important for speeches and all the rest, but the big issue is the budget. And we see whether this budget is going to be genuinely transformative or not, whether it will change people's lives, whether it will address the cost of living crisis that people are experiencing. And that is being exploited by Farage to therefore mobilise the anger, not against the system, but against a particular minority group. So I think our eyes now have got to look to the budget and see how far we can go there. Again, the lobbying between now and the budget in November is absolutely key for all of us, making sure that we've got clear policy demands and all of that. And I'll just give one example. In my area, I mentioned the rent increases. It would cost the government absolutely nothing if they introduce rent controls. And, you have the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, you have Andy Burnham in Manchester, Mayor of Manchester, Stevie Rotherham, Mayor in Liverpool, all asking for the power to have rent controls, which we used to have in this country. And yet the government just failed to move forward. And I think that's part of the sort of element of corporate capture of the government, that landlord lobby, that developer lobby that's lobbying the government so heavily on these particular issues. But again, between now and the budget, I think is this key political period now where we've got to mobilise around a number of these key issues. And it's almost like saving Labour from itself at the moment, waking them up to the fact this is a dangerous moment. The potential of a reform government being elected, I think, is frightening and worrying, and especially those other elements that are beyond reform, the real hardline far right that are appearing on our streets at the moment. It gives encouragement to them. So I think this is one of the most critical periods in my political life over the last 50 years, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a point well made. I was at a socialist meeting in Bournemouth yesterday. For the first time since, in my experience, the early 1980s, there were 25 fascists outside the meeting. Police had to be called to escort people safely out. That in my mind, if you put it together with the Tommy Robinson mobilisation in central London, these are they're not unprecedented in British history, but they're unprecedented in the last generation. And I think the point that you were making about the economic underpinnings of this is very important. I was talking to Richard Bergen on this programme only last week about the Resolution Foundation report, which said that there'd been £20,000 taken out of the average family's income in a decade. That's nearly £400 a week out of and I sometimes feel that that the government ministers, they don't seem to inhabit that world. They don't seem to know people who are being affected in that way. Do you think it's a dislocation problem in politics?
I think there's an element of that, certainly. There's an element of dislocation, not fully understanding what people are going through. And at the same time, that's reinforced by corporate lobby. And so that closes down, if you like, not just the understanding of what's happening, it closes down an understanding of the options that people that in government have. And again, in the Starmer speech, if you remember, he said there's no simple solutions to this, and particularly the economic situation. And he said, it's almost like don't believe those on the left or the right who are selling you easy solutions and they're snake oil salesmen, that sort of thing. That equation of the left and the right, I find, to be honest, I find offensive. But if you look at the proposals that others are putting up, and includes who you interviewed, Resolution Foundation, Patriotic Millionaires, IPPR, all of those think tanks that have brought forward, what they're saying to government, actually, there are solutions. Yeah, there's some complexities on some of them, but there's a range of solutions now that are needed. But they all focus on that issue you've just drawn attention to, the way people have suffered over austerity, but the way that has increased the grotesque levels of inequality of our society. And therefore, there has to be a government commitment to redistribution of wealth and power within our society. And on the wealth side, literally, you can't move each week with some proposal that's coming from a think tank about how you can redistribute that wealth. and use that wealth to lift people out of poverty, invest in our public services. You know, we had the ideas about, like Gordon Brown, a windfall tax. One of the ideas of a windfall tax is on who's made the most profits in this recent period. Excuse me, it's been the banks and the finance houses of the City of London. The other issue that's come up as well is, why are we allowing prices to escalate in these ways, particularly around food? In the past, we have had control of food prices, a basket full of prices. Why are we allowing the supermarkets to make such massive profits whilst people are going hungry? But the other arguments we've been putting forward, as you know, is that a financial transaction tax in the city, ironing out some of the stamp duty issues on shareholding and share sales, again, which is relatively easy to do. We're arguing at the moment as well for a land value taxation, because a lot of the wealth in this country is held in land and it's not taxed effectively, and the council tax system is not working. But the final point that's coming up time and time again is, why haven't we got an effective wealth tax in our society? You know, Richard Bergen was arguing along with the Wealth Tax Commission about, you know, a 2% levy on those people who've got more than £10 million to bring in the money that could actually fund our social service and health service. Again, the argument there, well, people will leave the country. But in other countries, they've introduced a levy if you want to leave the country, if you're wealthy like that. So there's all these solutions there, but the government is holding back. And there's an element of that sort of timidity is what's going to cost us in the long run, because people lose patience when they see a Labour government that's promised change and is not delivering it.
And John, what do you actually think is going to get done in the budget, though? Because Rachel Reeves's speech was pretty much, you know, a warning to other ministers as much as anything else that cuts were coming down the line. It seems to me that they tried to sort of avoid direct confrontation with the trade unions in the first year in office. A lot of the targeted cuts were at some of the poorest and most and weakest, they would have thought, I think, sections of the population. Those came unstuck. And it now seems they're going back and trying to get the same money, but out of a much more kind of stable centre of the working class. Is that how you read it?
I'm worried. It's difficult to speculate about what's coming up in the budget, of course, at this stage. But let me tell you my main worries. In the speeches that have been made, there's this issue about we have to do certain things like cut welfare, otherwise the bond markets will look upon this as a government that's unstable, and as a result of that, they'll increase basically the cost of borrowing. I just think that's ludicrous. I really do. What the bond markets are looking at, just the markets overall, all they want to know is the government stable in the sense it's maintaining its overall direction of travel. So they don't want any shocks. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, yeah, true. Is the government going to balance its budget? Is it going to make sure that its income matches its expenditure or goes in a timetable to enable that to happen? And therefore, the straightforward view is the way you manage it is, yes, you set out your program and then you set out your taxation program to enable you to afford that. And if you need to borrow, you will most probably be borrowing for longer term investment only. And as a result, people who engage in the bond markets will see that as a way in which you've got stable profit making. So they're trying to use the bond markets because of the trust fiasco to frighten people and therefore push them towards cuts rather than investment. The reason Truss was a disaster is purely and simply because she wanted levels of expenditure, cuts in taxation, and as a result of that, people looked at the budget and said, this just doesn't add up. Simple as that. So I think what we've got to argue between now and the budget is to say, look, the bond markets are not the issue. All they want is stable decision making in government. Set out your program, make sure you've got a taxation system which is fair and can afford it. Therefore, you have to look at redistribution of wealth. Simple as that. So I think what we'll see is the debate between now and the budget, those ones who are pushing for welfare benefit cuts I actually think it would destroy the Labour Party if they try and push it any further than they have done already. And there'll be others like me and others who'll be basically saying, you've got to come to terms with taxation of wealth. And throwing in examples like levying capital gains tax at the same level as income tax. I think Rachel Rees, there's a prospect that she'll go for some of these increased taxation measures, but at the same time, she'll want to see some welfare benefit cuts. And it could be I think it could be a budget, well, that undermines not just the future of government in future election. This could be a budget, if it goes wrong, I think it could undermine the standing of Keir Starmer within the Labour Party and may well cost him his job.
Interesting. John, I want to talk to you about that vote on Palestine as well.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the leadership worked very hard not to take a vote at all. And then when a vote was taken, worked very hard to make sure that it wasn't won, but it was. What do you read into that? How do you see the mood of Labour members and the attitude of the government towards it?
I think it demonstrated that the Labour leadership were completely out of step with the Labour Party members. And it wasn't just the constituency Labour parties, it was the trade unions, the affiliated organisations. And the big issue was, does the government recognise that genocide has taken place? And the government and the ministers that were involved in the discussions with delegates about the development of a resolution to go to conference, all they would concede is the risk of genocide. And people were just saying, this is ludicrous. There's a genocide taking place. We're watching it on our television screens every day. The UN Commissioner said there's a genocide taking place. Why doesn't this government accept that? And I think there are a number of reasons why that's the case. One is because I'm afraid we're aping Trump's policy position on all of this all the way through. And secondly, I think they realize that as soon as they accept there's a genocide, there's real responsibilities that fall on their shoulders as a government in terms of seeking peace and justice for the Palestinian people. And that would involve the end of the arms sales. Otherwise, you are completely complicit in that genocide. The sanctions that are needed with regard to Israel and its diplomatic isolation. So that was the debate that went on. And I was fairly pessimistic. I was unsure whether or not we'd get the vote. But what was interesting is that where, you know as well as I do, Don, party conferences can be controlled by the leadership to a large extent. You can manage it because they've got all the resources, the full-time staff, persuading people, etc. But again, although all of that was deployed, the members that were there stood firm and said, no, this is a genocide. It's quite obviously a genocide. We expect the government to realise that and implement the policy set out in the motion, which included the ending of the arms sales, the sanctions that are taking place. The recognition of the Palestinian state, we complimented the government on that, but recognition, actions have to follow on from recognition of the state itself. So no, the mood in conference itself was determined, and as a result, we won the motion. And I was very pleasantly surprised at the scale of it as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, John. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but my thanks there to John McDonnell, the Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington, for joining me, and to you for watching. Do tune in for future episodes of Analysis, but for now, good evening.